Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Closing in on the end of 2023, I'm Scott Parkin, your co-host in San Francisco, California. And as always, I am joined by...
Back in Ohio, it's Bazanko, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Festivus, Kwanzaa, whatever the holiday of your choice is. Have a good one.
I think we should convene a new holiday called Giuliani Day, which is where his ruling in the Georgia court the other day, or that he owes $148 million to two election workers that he defamed. That kind of made my day. I thought that was a day worth celebrating. And
as soon as the verdict came down, he defamed them again, and they've already filed another lawsuit against him. This guy is considered a brilliant lawyer. He has consulting firms all over the world and gets like huge money.
He's America's mayor. He was the hero of 9/11, right? You think he
dude,
was pulling girders of steel from the World Trade Center, the way they talk about him.
I would rather have Lionel Hutz than him.
It did become there at the end of 2020. He did become like the Lionel Hutz of America at that point.
Four seasons. Or what was Johnny Carson's lawyer was the bombastic Bushkin. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we just like our dig on Rudy, who is most known for 9/11, which is probably about the amount of money he's going to have left in his bank account before we're done. We're going to kick off a little bit with a radical history. The first one I want to say is that we actually missed this on our last radical history, even though we've done multiple shows on this, which is it was Noam Chomsky's birthday. Born December 7th, 1928. Needs no introduction or explanation from us. We have a whole playlist on YouTube. We have a whole segment to search on our website on Noam Chomsky. He's one of our most frequent guests. So happy birthday to Noam. 95 years old on December 7th.
Also, if any of you have access to Masterclass, there is Noam did one, and he had this really brilliant, handsome scholar interviewing him. Check that out too, the Noam Chomsky Masterclass, if you have access to that. It's short and superficial, but if you don't know much about him or you just want to see him talk, it was like I got to do that, and it's like one of the thrills of my life. And
it was almost hard to pay attention to what was being said because of the allure and the glow coming from Bob.
I wanted to downplay it because I didn't want to take all the attention and steal his thunder.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Me and Noam together, he'll be on the shadow. So
yeah, exactly.
I can't describe how much he means to me in my own career and to millions of us.
And we hopefully will be having another Chomsky related episode coming up soon. So just keep an eye out. Keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, the playlist is great. There's like long interviews. There's stuff that we did even before the podcast, like interviews that I did years ago on radio, and talk he gave in Houston a long time ago, very prescient talk right before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yeah, you can't know enough about him, and he's just been so inspirational to so many of us. So
happy birthday, Noam. On December 14th, 2000, Iraqi journalist Montadar al-Zaidi threw his shoes at President George W. Bush in protest of the U.S. occupation of Iraq. Is actually after Obama had even won the election. Zaidi shouted, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog," as he threw shoe number one. And then as he threw shoe number two, he said, "This is for the widows and orphans and all those killed in Iraq," with the second shoe. There's many politicians, there's many policymakers, there's many realist strategists that we would love to throw shoes at, and some of them didn't get that, and maybe some will in the future.
So if we were in the same room, one of us could throw a shoe at the other to simulate what happened.
Yeah. We don't ever know what happened to Zaidi, do we? Zaidi?
No.
Yeah. He'll go down in the annals of history, though, as for direct action against George H.W.
I remember some years later seeing some update about him. I forget where he is. I don't think he's in Iraq anymore, but I don't remember.
Well, at least he survived that.
Yeah.
Seriously, I wouldn't have been surprised if the Iraqi government had put him to death over that.
It's not like he was like waving a white flag and yelling.
Had his shirt off.
His shirt off, yelling a white flag in Hebrew and got killed by the IDF.
Yeah, by their snipers.
Yeah.
And then my last Radical Week in history, December 17th and December 18th. On December 17th, Mohamed Bouazizi, a young street vendor in Tunisia, set himself on fire in protest of the seizure of his goods by police. The next day, protests began, which toppled the government and in many ways transformed the Middle East, launching the Arab Spring. On December 18th, the following day, Bouazizi's self-immolation, protesters took to the streets of Tunisia and actually toppled the dictator Ben Ali, sparking off what would later be known as the Arab Spring, where we saw the toppling of governments in Egypt and Libya and a civil war in Syria. It was a massive event.
Yeah, really connected to events there today too. And did you have one more before? Okay, I have two. One, which I think are really cool ones, and one I want to spend some time on and bleed that into the first kind of substantive thing we do. But first, today we're doing this on December 19th, and on December 19th, 1940, one of I think the most important cultural figures in the 20th century was born, and that's Phil Oakes. And I suspect most of you listening to this know who Phil Oakes is, and if you're if you've been an activist of any kind, you would certainly know he is a really famous folk singer, an Ohio State student, which is always cool. Went to Ohio State, and there used to be some like old bars, like kind of grad student hangouts, where they would even have signs up there that said Phil Oakes played here and stuff like that. But just a really brilliant songwriter who died by suicide. The world just was very difficult for him in the 70s. He had just seen so many bad things happen and just couldn't handle it anymore. And obviously, he has so many famous songs, but I think right now the one that really resonates with me is "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." Watching what the liberals are doing right now in the world, I think he really was onto something really sharp and astute analysis there. So Phil Oakes, rest in power. And then the last thing on history, which I want to spend a little time on, and we can just talk about this and link it into kind of more contemporary stuff, is on December 18th, 1972, the Christmas bombings began. So this is our link to Christmas. This is our Christmas episode. So why not talk about mayhem, destruction, and bloodshed? The Christmas bombings was one of the final, kind of in many ways, the final act of the Vietnam War in terms of the actual conflict. There's a long background to it. What was it, this year? Oh yeah, early this year we did
the 50th anniversary.
And we did with Nome, right? Didn't we? We talked to Nome, and then we did one on our own, I believe.
Yeah.
We have two shows on that. We'll put it in the show notes. This also is connected to that. I don't want to go and repeat the whole long story because it's directly connected to the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, but usually not in the way that most people suggest. Most people give Nixon credit, right? That whole, like with Kissinger, right? They're strategic, they're realist, all this kind of stuff. But the real story, which I'm going to try to be brief on, is that in the fall of 1972, with Nixon's reelection coming up, he wanted to get out of Vietnam. He wanted that out of the way, thinking it would harm him because the war was very unpopular. And so he and Kissinger kind of reinvigorated peace talks and put new proposals together. And in turn, the Northern Vietnamese, Le Duc Tho, made a proposal which basically Kissinger and Nixon more or less accepted the outline of it. But then Nguyen Van Thu from Southern Vietnam issued what he called four no's, and he scuttled it. And at that point, Nixon, this is in October, not long before the election, Nixon at that point realizes that he's going to win the election no matter what. So he does a flip, and they turn on Le Duc Tho and the Northern Vietnamese, even though Northern Vietnamese have been negotiating in good faith and making proposals and concessions and just the basic stuff. But obviously, they're winning the war. So all the negotiations proposals were based on what would be best for them, because that's the way the war works, right? You win the war, you get to do that. And in turn, Nixon and Kissinger flipped. Kissinger called the Northern Vietnamese tawdry, filthy shits. And then on December 8th, as the talks broke down between the United States and the Northern Vietnamese, Nixon unleashed the most intense bombing, sustained and brief bombing campaign of the entire war. It was codenamed Operation Linebacker 2. Operation Linebacker was the massive bombing of 1972. This is Linebacker 2. But they became known as the Christmas bombings. They lasted 11 days between the 18th and the 29th. It was devastating in terms of the destruction it created. The U.S. sent fighter jets, F-105s, F-4s, F-111s, over 200 B-52 bombers, and B-52s are massive. They can saturate an area in 2 square miles with one load, one sortie. One of Kissinger's aides, Roger Morris, called it calculated barbarism.
Mhm.
And Morris and was it Tony Lake
Tony
resigned?
Lake resigned, yeah.
And Roger Morris resigned.
Tony Lake later became Bill Clinton's national security advisor.
Yeah, that's right. But Air Force tactical aircraft threw over 1,000 sorties. This is in 11 days. And B-52s, another 750. They dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs. They hit military targets. They hit the residential areas. They hit the DRVN's biggest hospital and destroyed it. They left craters with diameters of 50 feet. It was a massive level of destruction, and at a great cost. The physical destruction in North Vietnam was, it's there. It was visible and evident. But, and the American media focused on that, how much destruction that the U.S. had caused in the Christmas bombings. And then after that, the negotiations picked back up. And then just a few weeks later, in early, January 20, was it 23rd or something like 22nd, 23rd, a peace agreement was reached. So it happened very quickly. That wasn't because the Northern Vietnamese were bombed into submission. It was actually because the bombing had gone so badly for the United States. The conventional wisdom was just on its ear, right? Nixon was attacked globally. The Pope attacked him, and Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, I believe, compared it to Nazi atrocities. And just, it was condemnation all across the world. In addition to that, the U.S. admitted 15 B-52s had been shot down. Northern Vietnamese had Russian surface-to-air missiles, which were quite effective. The Northern Vietnamese claimed that they had shot down 34 B-52s. That's a huge cost, 15 or 34, either way, that's a massive cost, right? You lose 15 B-52s in 11 days, that's pretty intense. So along with the condemnation and the losses, the United States had to finally end the war. This also turned Americans against the war, like in Congress, even you had both in the Senate and House now, you had votes against the Vietnam War. And it's important to understand in terms of history, but I think it also has a couple other virtues talking about this. One is obviously that the conventional story that we often hear, the conventional narrative is skewed to satisfy ruling class interests. It becomes that Nixon, and the liberal media hates Nixon, but at the same time, Nixon bombed Vietnam into submission.
The madman, Richard.
The madman theory, because that was Kissinger, right? He would say, hey, I want to negotiate with you. I'm reasonable, but this guy, Nixon's a madman. I can't control him. He's going to blow the world up. So that's, I think, really important. It really had little military purpose. Politically, it backfired. Even Nixon understood at that point the war had to end, and they ended up with a deal in January of 73 that they probably could have had 4 years earlier. It wasn't much different than the proposals that had been floating around for quite some time. The second reason I think it's important to talk about this is because we're seeing like a Vietnam today. And I think what we're seeing in Gaza, which everybody, because of social media, I think to a large degree, we're seeing it like immediate, and we're seeing it in its most graphic form. Like in Vietnam, you have a couple like searing images that like will always be powerful, right? Like the little girl with the napalm scars all over, and the police chief alone killing the guy, the Viet Cong guy, shooting him in the head.
During Tet.
Yeah, during Tet, right? So you have some images like that. We're getting multiple images like that every day now out of Gaza. And I think it's important to understand this is not, it's horrific. It's the worst thing I've seen in a long time. But this is what the U.S. did in Vietnam. And the Christmas bombings is a good example of that, because I've been reading all these legitimate outrage, justifiable outrage, necessary outrage over like bombing a hospital or bombing a refugee camp or whatever. That's the Vietnam War. Yeah.
Or killing people in mosques and churches.
Yeah. The hospitals, right? The United States destroyed the biggest hospital in Hanoi.
Yeah.
It just blew it up, right? The Vietnamese, Vietnam had a significant advantage over Gaza. It's a big country. You can get people in and out. There's places for them to hide. Hanoi had been cleared out pretty well by the time the United States bombs were there, but still it created immense destruction. Hospitals, schools. The U.S. fought that kind of a war. A famous general named Telford Taylor, who had been a prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote a book in the 70s called Nuremberg and Vietnam, where he talked about America's war crimes and America's atrocities. And I think now, and I'm not suggesting in any way to downplay what's happening in Gaza, but I think it's useful to understand this is not rare. It's not one of a kind, right? This is the way empires act. And the United States is culpable for both, right? The United States is culpable in Vietnam. It essentially invented South Vietnam. It sent gazillions of dollars there in terms of aid and weapons, and it essentially their currency. It controlled everything, right?
Mm.
And the war would have ended in the early 60s. I don't think anybody would doubt that, just because the situation was so bad. That war was about to end just because the Southern regime couldn't sustain itself any longer. But Kennedy was going to get out, right? You knew that was coming. You knew that was coming, right?
I was waiting. Ba-boom, ba-boom.
But boom, yeah, it's and so the United States was responsible. The United States created just incredible mayhem. It dropped 4.6 million tons of bombs, killed maybe 3 million Vietnamese total. Majority of
More
them
than
were,
was dropped on Germany and Japan in the whole of
yep,
World War II.
combined. Actually, it killed maybe 2-3 million people. The majority of them were civilian. Created 15,000 refugees. Left tons of unexploded bombs in Laos alone. The United States dropped, 80 million cluster bombs, and 30% never detonated. We had a show on that a couple of years ago from Legacies of War. So
It's still being cleaned up. I personally traveled to the Plain of Jars, which is one of the main places that were bombed, and you're not allowed to go off these very specified trails because the cluster bombs are so embedded in everything around there.
Yeah, every year we're still seeing a significant number of kids, especially, killed in places like Laos and Cambodia. They see it, they think it's a baseball, they think it's a toy or something like that. And I think as we see what's happening today in Gaza, it's obviously important to call them out, to expose what they're doing. But I think it's also important to understand that it's not that easy to make a moral appeal and to condemn people and make them look bad, because they don't really care. The United States was condemned in the Christmas bombings. Olaf Palme is comparing it to the Nazis, and Mao and Brezhnev are attacking the U.S. and Western Europeans are attacking the U.S. And they didn't care, you know.
I think it's interesting. I remember during the Clinton years that the Clinton administration was always afraid of being cast as some sort of warmonger, don't want to get pulled into another quagmire, like when we talked about like former Yugoslavia and things like that. But like Bush and Obama, and then Trump and Biden, it's all changed. They just don't give a shit. It's like Obama just drones and kills anyone who got in their way. And Biden is just like pouring huge chunks of money into Israel and into Ukraine, which is actually one of the interesting things to me about Gaza, but I also think this applies to Ukraine, is it's actually a war that's being played out on social media. Like when we talked about Desert Storm in 91, and we talked about the Iraq War in 2003, those were definitely wars that played out in the media, like CNN and the 24-hour news cycle and stuff. But with these two current conflicts, we're seeing it play out on social media. I can't, it's probably also because of who I follow and what the algorithm sends to me, but I don't look at some of my social media feeds without seeing like horrific pictures of children being pulled out of rubble and children dying in hospitals and things like that. And that's, if think about it, if that had happened in 1972, what would that have done? That Nixon and Kissinger's narrative would have been a lot harder to sustain.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly, yeah. If there had been Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff in the early 60s, Vietnam would have been. But at the same time, and I'm not denying that people need to resist this, but I think Vietnam is instructive in showing just what they're willing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand. I don't know. I have these really horrific ideas about how things in Gaza are going to end, because if you study the United States and American interventions and American empire and American wars, they always end the same way, with just immense bloodshed and destruction. And at the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, you started hearing people talk about the Vietnam syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm.
The United States won't be doing this anymore because we've learned our lesson and we've seen the limits of our power and all that. And that really didn't last. Really.
Not at all.
We've talked a lot. Jimmy Carter was a highly interventionist president. Today, like, I've been thinking about that, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, as I see these like images which just pop up literally like every minute. And I've been thinking a lot more about Vietnam, which I obviously know way more about the history of the Vietnam War than I do about the Middle East. But I know enough about the Middle East to see this pattern here. And I think in many ways that makes the problem, because a lot of people want to turn this into a problem about religion, Islam, Jewish people, Christians, and all that kind of stuff, or about a class of civilizations or all that kind of thing. But it's really At the end of the day, you have an empire and a colony, an occupying force and a colony. And occupiers are bloodthirsty bastards. Go through what the Europeans did in the Congo and in India, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, what the US has done all over.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I would like to think that if Biden's reelection right now is this like beyond being in the toilet, it's flushed. And,
the 18 to 29-year-olds, which has been the key part of Biden's coalition in the last 3 election cycles, we've said this before, now trending towards Trump, which is unreal.
No,
it's unreal. And I know there's a whole bunch of liberals that we're friends with who are like, think about the Supreme Court. And clearly people are taking that into account and this is still happening.
Yeah. And look at how well it worked out with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Having her on the court was great. Really glad she stayed on as long as she did too. And no, it's mystifying, right? And Biden's numbers have been underwater for a long time, but they weren't like he and Trump were really pretty close. But since October 7th or October 8th, they've been in free fall. And the biggest reason for that, and the New York Times Siena College poll came out, I think today, which has the numbers even worse. That's the one that shows 18 to 29-year-olds are now trending to Trump. But just in general, the entire country is opposed to what's happening. You have significant opposition to the U.S. support of Netanyahu pretty much everywhere in every group, right? Biden's support of Israel is dragging him down. And especially among the groups that put him over the top in 2020, young voters, non-white voters, African Americans, and
Arab Americans in particular.
Arab Americans, forget it, man. He's down to, he was at what, 60 or 70%, now down to like 17. You have AIPAC going after Democratic representatives who are sympathetic for Palestine, right? So I don't see how the Democratic Party digs out of this hole. And they keep shoving them down your throat. The worse things get. The guy is basically politically, he's stage 4, metastatic, right? But they keep trotting him out there. And that was, I think, LBJ in 1968 understood what Vietnam was doing to him. Yeah. And his prospects weren't nearly as bad as Biden's. I think LBJ, his whole life wanted to run against Nixon. It's really, apparently he regretted dropping out after that because he always said he would have beaten Nixon. It probably would have. He was a brilliant politician.
Yeah.
LBJ was as good as any I've studied. But anyway, I don't know, just like talking about the Christmas bombings. Oh, God.
The only other thing I want to say about the flailing of Biden's coalition and support is we're also seeing where the United Auto Workers have come out and called for a ceasefire. Sean Fain last week actually held a rally with Rashida Tlaib. I actually didn't know this until recently. Rashida Tlaib's dad was actually an auto worker in Dearborn who was a UAW member. Yeah. And Michigan, forget about it. Like that was like key to beating Trump in 2020.
Trump's ahead by 8 points in Michigan or something. It says a lot about America. It's scary. It's terrifying, right? That Trump could have this kind of support. That's terrifying. It is, and I concede that. But at some point,
we're in the same space as Trump as we are on Putin. He's a monster, and I guess we have to say it every time because we don't want Trump reelected. But still,
it's easy to sit around and talk about how horrible Trump voters are, and a lot of them they're just unreachable. A lot of people are unhappy with him, and the polls show that. There's no real, like, other than that crazy base of Trump people, which isn't insignificant, but Trump doesn't have enough support among the crazy base to win an election. There are other Republicans, the Chris Christie, Nikki Haley types, who aren't quite as far out there, but the Democrats are giving him nothing. They're giving him nothing. And now, in fact, you have not just the support of, you have a war in Ukraine that's flailing. We are now on the bizarre world of being on the same side as like these crazy right-wing Republicans who oppose the war in Ukraine and want to cut off funding. It's insane, right?
Yeah.
He's on the wrong side in Gaza. He's now basically thrown in the towel on immigration, and he's going to accept all of the Trump policies. And you have liberals like Fetterman in Pennsylvania following suit. Mm-hmm. You have Democrats throughout places like New York who are heavily surveilling. They're involved in heavy surveillance of anti-protest groups against Israel. Everybody is anti. So that's the other thing, being like everybody's anti-Semitic today or this and that. That was Vietnam, especially in the early stages. If you opposed the Vietnam War, right, you were a communist sympathizer, you were sympathizing with terrorists. The descriptions too, and this is really telling, I think, and worth studying. The descriptions of the Viet Cong, especially earlier on, were just like what you're hearing about Hamas today, right? It's a terrorist group, and we can't negotiate with terrorists and all that kind of stuff. And the Viet Cong, a lot of lefties and liberals ended up lionizing the VC. But today, every time, that's the fucking Zionist basic response, right? Anytime you say something, they blew up a hospital, but Hamas. They killed a bunch of little kids, but Hamas, right? They blew up a refugee camp, Hamas, right? And it's just really, I've never really believed that history could teach us much because people don't learn from their mistakes, right? And, oh, we study history. We don't. No one learns from it. If we all get divorced multiple times, right? We don't learn from our mistakes. Some of us do.
Your history, so you just keep marching into doing the same thing that they did 50 years ago.
Yeah, and yet as I study, and I don't want to make too much out of this, but as I follow every day these horribly gripping stories coming out of Gaza, these just horrific, they just remind me so much of the United States and Vietnam, right? The United States committed atrocities on a regular basis, not just My Lai, but what was it, the Tiger Force, and just countless instances like that. The kinds of stories we're hearing and seeing in Gaza today aren't that different than what the United States was doing in Vietnam. So I guess,
or really for them at Iraq and Afghanistan,
anywhere,
20
right?
years ago.
No, anywhere, right? And Ukraine too. Ukraine is also a bloodbath, right? And the thing is, in Ukraine, I want the war to end just because it's a bloodbath, right? Not out of any support for Russia whatsoever. Gaza's a little different. It's a bloodbath and I want it to end, but you can't doubt the aspirations of the Palestinian people and what they've been through. And so I'm not going to sit around. It's obligatory. You have to condemn Hamas. Nobody gives a shit if I say anything about Hamas. Netanyahu, Hamas itself, nobody cares. Doesn't matter what we say about Hamas, right? And that's a slick game. You're not condemning Hamas. You're anti-Semitic. You're said from the river to the sea. You're on all this kind of shit. And in Vietnam, it is ironic though, isn't it? Right? That in the United States, you will suffer graver consequences for attacking and criticizing Israel than you do for the United States, right? There are freaking laws that say you're not allowed to advocate a boycott of Israel, right? That's the US Constitution won't allow that.
Yeah.
So it's insane. But the Vietnam legacy right now I've been thinking about it a lot because the outcome of that wasn't great, obviously. Millions of people dead, just the country devastated, destroyed, ecocide. And that's the thing. At least in Vietnam or in Ukraine, it's a kind of a big country and people can move around and get away. And there's a level of autonomy. Whereas the Viet Cong, they had the support of an independent of northern Vietnam, not only northern China and Russia as well, but northern Vietnam. Gaza doesn't have anything like that. Gaza exists inside this brutal occupying state of Israel.
Yeah.
And you have really nowhere to go. You're on the border of a country that doesn't want you. You have the sea next to you. Hopefully, wiser heads will prevail. I would like, if I saw Biden, among the many things I would tell him is, why don't you do what LBJ did in 1968?
Yeah, go
Stay home, drop out of the race. Don't run your vice president, though. That would be probably even worse. The only thing also to point out is Henry Kissinger also has a major role to play in all this stuff. And we just did a little bit of what do you call it? The opposite of a tribute.
a roast.
A roast, yeah.
Not a roast.
Now that has I'm thinking of like Don Rickles and Frank Sinatra. But at any rate, Kissinger died recently, and we did a little bit on him. And that's also a segue for this, right? The Dark Prince, Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, exactly.
Biden is very Kissingerian right now.
Blinken and Hillary Clinton definitely channeling their old mentor.
Yeah. I think this stuff, and also, I'm not just saying this, Kennedy too. This is very Kennedy-esque. Yeah.
Yeah. The only other thing that I want to talk about today is the other crises engulfing our world, which played out in the annual COP28, the Conference of the Parties. Something like 80,000 delegates went to the United Arab Emirates for this year's COP in Abu Dhabi or what have you, which is quite ironic.
What describes your commitment to ending global warming more than having your meeting in Abu Dhabi?
In a petrostate. And the COP28 president designate was Sultan Al Jaber, who is actually the head of the UAE National Oil Company. And there
That's
were
like having a Weight Watchers convention, like in an Italian deli.
that's like having Henry Kissinger convene a peace conference, right?
Charlie Sheen give lectures on sobriety.
Exactly.
We could continue this all day.
Yeah, we can stay here all day, folks. We're here all day. And it also turns out with some leaked documents that were found that the UAE planned to make oil deals all during the COP28 conference.
Convenient.
But how convenient. But I actually just want to, this will probably be pretty quick, and maybe we'll have a longer show about COP and climate. We actually haven't talked about that in a minute, but something like 200 countries at COP28 agreed to phase down fossil fuels, which is actually the first time it's ever come out of the agreement, which kind of signifies nothing. Nations have been faced with pressure to block new oil and gas projects for a long time. None of them actually have any sort of mechanisms to phase out fossil fuels. OPEC actually threatened a boycott and all kinds of pressure tactics on oil consuming nations if they acted actually on a phase out of fossil fuels. And I also want to say this is COP28, which means that there were 27 COPs before that where they never mentioned the word fossil fuels. Very important. But there's a number of Democrats and progressives calling on Biden to stop massive new fossil fuel developments. Just so to be clear, Biden keeps approving this, whether it's like gas export in the Gulf of Mexico or Alaska LNG or pipelines like the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Biden's full steam ahead in approving and rubber stamping oil and gas infrastructure projects. Also should be noted that as soon as this COP agreement was made, that climate groups in the United Kingdom actually filed a lawsuit to block a massive new oil field in the North Sea, saying that it actually violated obligations to target net zero carbon emissions. That being said, I like to focus when we have these COPs on more what's happening with people who are actually doing a lot of resistance. I did see one interesting stat, which is there's been this divestment movement for over a decade now. Climate activists actually say that more than 1,600 institutions have now cut ties with the fossil fuel industry, whether it's like city governments or universities, or endowments, all that sort of stuff. Over 41 trillion in assets have been divested from the fossil fuel sector. And then activism is in a very interesting space. We're seeing a lot of people in the street, particularly around Gaza. We're seeing massive acts of civil disobedience. Actually, for the 8th night of Hanukkah last week, 8 bridges in 8 cities around the country were blockaded by Jewish Voices for Peace. The Arab community is doing protests and direct action, regularly, whether it's at weapons manufacturers or whether it's at politicians' offices or what have you. And Biden actually can't seem to this is another thing to go with Biden and Gaza, is that Biden can't actually seem to have a fundraiser anywhere without 1,000 people outside disrupting it. So it's very important to note. But it also means things have been a little bit more quiet on the climate front. We have seen some actions. There was actually a really fantastic action about 2 weeks ago where Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, was having an event and climate activists surprised him and with a great banner that said "Eat shit, Darren," and basically shut down the event where all the participants fled the room. But the other thing, I love that.
The anarchists are here. Ron Edith.
It's the anarchists are here.
The anarchists don't know. Like a George Romero zombie movie or something.
Yeah, exactly. But just reflecting this week on the empty promises coming out of COP, I always like to focus on those who are being impacted by fossil fuel extraction and the climate crisis, and those putting up real resistance to it, not just symbolic photo ops in front of the White House, but people fighting infrastructure and extraction. We've had some shows on the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Last week, a Mountain Valley Pipeline activist got sentenced to 3 months in jail for locking themselves to the pipeline. There's also a wave of lawsuits and escalated charges going at groups and individuals which are fighting Mountain Valley Pipeline. There was actually a pretty big action in October, and a number of the people have actually gotten felony charges out of it, which is something to be concerned about and something that's being lost in all the noise of everything else going on in the world. Also connected to this, Cop City, we've also had a number of episodes on Cop City. 61 Cop City activists right now are facing RICO charges, criminal RICO charges from the state of Georgia. And so people who are fighting extraction projects, development projects, fossil fuel infrastructure, what have you, are actually facing jail time, facing like pretty serious charges of RICO or domestic terrorism. Similarly, in France and the United Kingdom and Germany, we're seeing crackdowns on climate activists. But most importantly, and we actually just did a show related to this recently with Brandon Lee, but in the sort of global South countries, in 2022, 171 land defenders, environmentalists, indigenous community leaders were actually murdered for defending land against extractive industry, with the countries with the most people who were murdered being Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines, but there's many other countries as well. And as we see these empty promises coming out of COP, I always like to just lift up the people who are like doing some of the real fighting and people who are facing real jail time and real life-threatening circumstances. And definitely would encourage people to watch our interview with Brandon Lee, which we just posted, who was an environmental organizer working with indigenous communities on Luzon, and he was targeted for assassination and was left a quadriplegic. It's a horrible story, and it was a great interview with Brandon. So anyway, that's my sort of rant on COP28.
It reminds me of Chico Mendes'
Yep.
observation: without class struggle, environmentalism is just gardening, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And obviously, we've talked about this many times. One of our first shows was the story of plastics. We should recycle and do all that stuff. It's essential and necessary. But by itself, that's not going to cut it. I mean, obviously, these corporations are causing, I don't know, what, like 3/4 of the pollution or something like that. It's immense. So
there's some crazy number, like 80% of emissions come from actually U.S. companies.
And just a small number of them too, right?
Yeah.
So
like 25 companies maybe.
Yeah, no, and it would be great if everything was recycled and more of us were vegetarians and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is these corporations are just, and even more than that now with the Department of Defense, with these wars, I think that's another part of these wars in Ukraine and Israel. There's just like environmentally cataclysmic. That's in Vietnam. There's some stuff no one's ever written, like a really good book on the environmental war in Vietnam. It's out there, man. If any of you are thinking of a PhD in history, I just gave you an award-winning topic. But the environmental destruction of Vietnam, there's some stuff on it, but nothing really great. And I think that if you look at the level of dioxins, the level of napalm, white phosphorus, which is being used in Gaza, which has been used in Gaza repeatedly, it was used in Gaza in lead cast and protective edge as well. Israel's known for that, right?
Yeah.
All these things are repetitive, right? It's not new. And as horrific and evil, I think, as Netanyahu is he worse than Joe Biden? Is he worse than Nixon? Is he worse than JFK or any of these guys? They're all the same person. And I think we often ignore that link between the environment and wars, right? How wars really create these cataclysmic conditions that just make everything worse and kill the most vulnerable people and lead to all kinds of crises.
And not for nothing, the Pentagon's the biggest emitter on the planet.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, military wars and militaries are a huge factor, right?
Yeah.
But remember, what's her name from Massachusetts? Warren, when she ran for president, wasn't like a big part of her climate crisis policy. Her platform was going to be to make the Pentagon green, right? We're going to give them, like, I don't know, biodegradable bullets or white phosphorus that doesn't, I don't know what the hell they're going to do, but it's
low emission white phosphorus.
Yeah. But my point, what I was trying to make is that the wars and the environment are really closely linked as well. And that's something to keep in mind. If you've been in Vietnam, I mean, you've seen it, what's happened and the legacy. We've talked about things like dioxin and Agent Orange.
I think some folks in the audience know I campaigned for a long time around strip mining in Central Appalachia 10, 15 years ago. And mountaintop removal coal mining was actually a big part of what we were fighting against. And so you go to the southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky and places like that, where they've literally just blown the top off of mountains and just left moonscape. And it was fascinating when I was actually traveling through Central Highlands in Vietnam. You would go through these areas where there was like a lot of intense fighting between the US and the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong or what have you. And it looked exactly like what I saw in Central Appalachia. It was really striking for me at the time.
Yeah. How many times have I said it? Biden never came to East Palestine. There are parts of East Palestine that look like they did the day the train derailed.
Yeah.
Palestine, East Palestine, he doesn't give a shit about either.
No.
So.
No.
But yeah, and obviously the thing with these wars is like justifiably, we've seen this so many times. We did it ourselves in 2003, right? When you're involved in environmental work and you're gearing up, you have this big campaign about COP and about all this other stuff going on, and then two wars break out. And a lot of people naturally are going to either set aside what they're doing or put it in the background, or just ignore it altogether and begin doing anti-war work. And other causes are damaged because we're trying to do what we can to end this horrific war atrocity. And so it just makes the ruling class has so much going on, countless strategies. It's got his fingers. The famous Robert Taft, Mr. Republican senator, when the National Security Act was being proposed, he was an anti-imperialist, even though he was a Republican, really hardcore anti-imperialist.
Yeah.
And he said, with the National Security Act and constant preparedness, military preparedness, we will have our fingers in every pie. We will be involved in every conflict all over the globe. And that's exactly what's happening, right? The ruling class is able to do this and juggle all these balls because they're so fucking wealthy and powerful, and they have all these armies and these weapons. And all we have is the majority of the people in the world, right?
Yeah, and as disorganized as we are.
Yeah, and the thing is that the climate crisis, it's not the kind of thing you can be casual and just wait it out. It's getting worse, right? If some of these scientists are correct, it's terrifying, right? We don't have much time left, and probably can't reverse it at this point anyway. And yet, what you can't just ignore Gaza or ignore whatever in order to do that. But you're dealing with two critical, it's like a triage, right? You're in the hospital, there's been this massive catastrophe, and you have to decide what to work on, what to try to fix. And everything is on life support. And you got these wars, you got the environmental degradation, you got this horrible immigration crisis. You've got a healthcare system which is just utterly horrible in the United States. There's another surge in COVID right now, and it's just it's ignored. It's over. It never happened. I don't know. Did COVID
crushing levels of debt? Crushing levels of debt.
Crushing levels of debt and educational debt. The educational system in places like Texas is a joke. They're just destroying public education, and so there's so much going on. What do you do? It's not like any of these are just like casual issues that you could just ignore. They're all urgent and immediate. Yeah. And in normal times, I always thought for decades now that the climate crisis is the most important because that had the capacity to just destroy all of us. And it does. But now Gaza and Ukraine and all these other things we just mentioned are out there. So I don't know. If people would just listen to the Green and Red podcast and do everything we said, I think we'd be fine. It would be like free bubble up and rainbow stew. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Folks, the other thing is it's the end of the year, so we're going to be doing a bunch of fundraising pushes, and we have a number of certain days calendars. We've actually already given away one for a very generous donor. And so if you want a certain days calendar for 2024, please email us at greenandredpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll get you one. And yeah, and we'll be putting out a whole lot more about that too. We'll have a couple more episodes this year before we wrap up 2023. Oh, Bob has a has a prop there, or a visual aid.
Yeah, not this one because somebody used this. It wasn't me. Yeah, I've come up with. I found some of these which I didn't know I had. So if any of you are interested, it's a brilliant book. It's repudiates the JFK story. It has a great blurb on the back from none other than Seymour Hersh. It's been invoked by Noam Chomsky many times. If you want a copy, make a donation, like $35, let's say, whatever. Send us a nice amount. Enough to cover postage and leave us a little bit to pay the bills. So let's say $30. $30.
$30. So 25 if you want a calendar, 30 if you want a copy of Masters of War.
Yeah. If you want it signed, then we can negotiate because my signature is worth so much.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, but yeah, I've got some of these too if anybody's interested. So
Yep. And we'll be putting stuff out about that on our website and stuff like that as well. Folks,
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Happy holidays. Happy holidays.
Hanukkah, you name it, whatever, Festivus, whichever one you want.
Yep. And hey, folks, if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit subscribe on YouTube if you're not already subscribing. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And especially with the end of the year, go to greenandredpodcast.org, hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. and everyone misbehave, and we'll catch you all again real soon.
Where I'd kill my share of engines in 1,000 different fights. I was there at the Little Big Horn. I heard many men lying, I saw many more dying, but I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars. It's always the young to fall. Now look at all